I'm going to show you exactly how I made this Backrooms animation in Blender and how you can make your own one from scratch. The best part is that the only thing you need is a computer and 3D software. If you break down the scene, it is actually made out of very simple geometry. There's just a floor, walls, and office ceiling that is working as a light source. The walls have a simple pattern, and the ground is just a carpet. Hop in the Blender and open a new scene. Delete everything and add a plane. Now scale the plane based on how big you want your map to be. I will make that plane 100 by 100 meters. And if you don't know how big your plane is, press N and go to Item, where you can see the dimensions of the object. Now duplicate the same plane and move it about 2.2 meters higher, because it will serve as a ceiling. Now we need to make the walls. There are a lot of ways you can do this, so I will show you two non-destructive methods. The first method is with geometry nodes, and the second is by using Blender's built-in extension. Let's begin with the first method. So open geometry nodes and create a new node group. Delete the group input and add a grid node. We need a lot more geometry, so let's increase the amount of vertices. This depends on how big you want your map to be, but I want my map to be large. Now let's add two textures to tell Blender which parts of the geometry we want to delete and which parts we want to preserve. So switch the first texture to 4D and adjust the properties by increasing the scale, the detail, and roughness. Now add these two textures together by using Math node and add the color ramp. Then add delete geometry node, plug the mesh into the geometry socket and plug the color ramp to the selection. Make sure you are deleting faces. Now add the extrude mesh and extrude the remaining geometry into walls. Make the height around 2.2 meters high, which is the average height of a ceiling. You can now play with the W slider to create different variations of the map. Now when the modeling is done, let's move to lighting and texturing. First create three materials and name them. For the lighting, we need to recreate this office ceiling where the light is coming directly from the material. For that, we can use a similar texture with the same office lighting that is available on Ambient CG for free. So just go on their website and download the same ceiling material. I also found this fabric material which will be used to make the ground. To apply the materials correctly, use the plane dimensions and divide them by the scale of the material, which you can find on the same website. Now the materials are tiled in the real scale. Now for the ceiling, connect the emission map and increase the emission strength. It was working, but I thought it would be more interesting if the lights were flickering randomly. So I added a Voronoi texture, a color ramp, and a multiply operation to create a random light flickering. Also, don't forget to change the texture to 4D so you can adjust and animate the W slider to make the effect animated. Optionally, you can also increase the scene exposure and use the false color to see if the lighting is strong enough and which areas are underexposed or overexposed. But now we need to texture the walls. If you take a closer look at one of those popular backroom videos on YouTube, you can see that the wall has a special pattern that we need to use as well. Again, just search for Backrooms wall texture and pick a good looking one. Now to apply this image texture to the walls, go to the shader editor, select the texture and import it in the editor. If you have Node Wrangler enabled, press Ctrl T, which will add mapping setup. Increase the scale of the texture on all axes and switch from UV to object. Now add a cube and select the cube in the texture coordinates. Select the cube again and rotate the cube until the texture is displayed properly. And that's basically the first method. You can switch between variations or use the color ramp to adjust the distribution of walls. However, if you look at the video, you will notice that the render do not quite match with the scene from the footage. The walls are longer, evenly distributed and more organized. So that's why I also tried the second method, which was by using Archimesh. You can enable this extension in preferences. Now if you open the sidebar, you will see that besides different architectural elements, you have this room button, and if you click on it, you will procedurally create nice looking walls and procedurally adjust all parameters such as height, thickness or number of walls. You can also include a baseboard, as it is common for interior spaces. If you analyze the back rooms, you will notice that some rooms are repeating, which you can easily recreate by adding an array modifier to the walls. So create more variations and use array modifier to fill the space. For the wall material, you can use the same process as we used in the first method. Now it would not be a horror game without entities. Honestly, I am not much into character animation, so I downloaded this 3D model from Sketchfab, which is already rigged, so I just appended the object and put it at the end of the animation. I didn't want to do another walking animation, so I left him standing there but added keyframes to create a simple hand motion as if he were reaching out to me. Special thanks to this guy who made the 3D model. Now let's break down the camera movement. Honestly, this was probably the hardest thing to do because I wanted to simulate the camera shake from walking to make the motion feel more natural. So first I wanted to animate the path of the camera, so I used a Bezier curve to make a track. To animate the camera, add a cube, snap the camera to the cube, Add follow path constraint to the cube, select the curve as a path, and when you parent the camera to the cube, you can add keyframes to the offset and animate the camera along the curve. After that, I moved to the graph editor and started adjusting the motion speed because I wanted some variations in the camera motion. If you flatter the graph, the walk speed becomes slower, almost like the camera is not moving at all. If you make a big spike, the camera's motion becomes faster. Now, in order to make the motion more realistic, I want to randomize the camera motion. We will use the modifier tool to add noise texture to the camera's rotation. So add a keyframe to each axis and add noise. The intensity will probably be higher than we want it to be, so decrease the intensity and adjust the size of the curve, so that when you play the timeline, the graph matches real camera motion. Now the backrooms are done, but there are still some settings we can adjust to make the render more real. So I made a poster of the entity, put it on the wall, and made a short camera zoom to boost the perception that someone is actually holding the camera. To make the zoom, just animate the focal length. Also, to put some objects out of focus, add the new empty object to your scene, enable depth of field in the camera properties, and choose the empty as the target object. Now, if you animate the empty, it seems like the camera is constantly refocusing, which also contributes to realism, as it is quite common for older VHS cameras. And because motion creates motion blur, you should also enable it in the render properties. Now it is time to render the animation. So go to output properties, create a new folder where the renders will be saved, and set the image format to PNG with 8-bit color depth and 0 compression. Unfortunately, the animation is over 1 minute long, and when I tried to render it, the average render time was about 10 minutes per frame, which is not a very good deal because when you do the math, it would take forever to render such a long animation. So I enabled experimental mode, dropped down the light bounces and the sample per image, disabled caustics and changed the performance settings to fast rendering. And because I used only 100 samples per image, I enabled denoising data in layer properties and added a denoise node in the composer to smooth out the leftover noise. I also switched from CUDA to optics and tried to render again. And to my surprise, I cut the render time from 10 minutes to 3 minutes, which is a very significant difference. But still, even with 3 minutes per frame, it took 94 hours to render, which is almost 4 days of rendering. So I decided to usually render the animation overnight so I could work on my other projects during the day. Finally, after like a week of rendering, I finally got the whole animation stored frame by frame as an image sequence. So now to transfer this image sequence to a single video, create a new project in Blender, go to Video Sequencer, and import the image sequence to the timeline. But before you do this step, make sure that the resolution and FPS match the scene setting. Now when you hit render again, the image sequence will be converted into one single video. The animation is done now, so the next step is video editing. The goal here is to use effects and filters to lower the video quality and mimic old VHS camera artifacts to enhance the vibe. I used CapCut because for basic video editing, it was more than enough. So I dropped some retro effects to distort the video quality and some transitions to simulate the VHS startup. Nothing too crazy, just enough so the effect is noticeable but not distracting. Also, since there is no audio, it wouldn't be an animation without any proper sound effects. The majority of the sound effects I used came from Pixabay. I used sound effects such as light buzzing, VHS camera sounds, and background noises. Also, I found this step sound, which was pretty cool, so I used it to match the camera motion. And that's how you make Backrooms completely from scratch. Honestly, it is much easier than you think it is. You only need a computer and a blender, that's it. The only thing that I found a little harder than I expected was to set up the camera motion, because I usually only do animations with a fixed camera. Besides that, I believe anyone can do this, and if you render the animation overnight, you will also save a lot of time. That is all from my side. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.